Season 2, Episode 1, False Claims, Real Consequences. This podcast reflects personal memories, interpretations, and opinions. All individuals mentioned are entitled to the presumption of innocence. While every effort has been made to tell the story truthfully and factually, some details may be subjective or based on personal recollection. Listeners should approach the content as a personal narrative, not a formal or factual record. At the end of Season 1, we left off with me being rushed into the operating room, and then everything went black. I'm sure you figured it out by now, but I didn't die. I woke up in the ICU, staring at the same nurse that I started the morning with, the one who looked like Jennifer Love Hewitt. For a moment, I was disoriented. Had any of this even happened? Was it all some nightmare? The nurse explained that several hours had actually passed, and that Anna had been anxiously waiting for me to open my eyes. When Anna came in, she filled in the blanks. Not only had they stopped the bleeding, but they also had to pump my stomach, which was filled with blood. The doctor told me that I'd come dangerously close to needing a transfusion. It had been touch and go for quite a while. But survival wasn't the end of the story. Recovery was its own battle. The pain medication they prescribed me was written wrong. Instead of every 4 to 6 hours, it was ordered for once a day. I was left in misery, unable to sleep, barely able to function. Nearly a week later, exhausted and broken down, I ended up back in the ER where they discovered the mistake. They finally gave me something to help me sleep and sent me home with my dad. But the damage was already done. Between the blood loss and the botched prescription, it took me almost 2 weeks to get back on my feet. Somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, we sat down and reviewed the lawsuit that Darren and Melissa had filed against my parents. And honestly, it was a complete sham. Even on paper, it looked less like a legal argument and more like another grab at Chet's life. Another attempt to squeeze out whatever they could. The way it was filed was strange. Their demand was to remove my dad, Ed, as trustee, put Darren back in, and reinstate the old trust. But here's the thing. If I remember correctly, there wasn't even a new trust yet. What existed was the removal of Darren as trustee, exactly as Chet and Lois had requested. So why go after my parents and sue them over Chet's trust? It didn't add up. Melissa, meanwhile, was out spreading her own version of the story. She started calling people, claiming that my mom had somehow forced Lois to sign in front of the notary when Darren was removed. That it was all undue influence by my parents, but the irony was impossible to ignore. She wasn't describing what actually happened. She was describing herself, accusing us of the very tactics she was guilty of using. At the end of Season 1, I told you that Darren eventually ended up behind bars. That was true, but unfortunately, it wasn't for attacking me, which I'll get to soon. What we later uncovered was that Darren had been arrested on October 5th, 2021. This was exactly what Lois had warned us about when she talked about Darren's temper and how quickly he could snap. According to the police report we obtained, Darren was arrested by the Yorba Linda Police Department, right in the same area as the so-called Dream House. He was booked, held for several hours, and then released. Now that might sound like just another mark on Darren's record, but it became very important later. During a deposition, Darren was asked under oath if he had ever been arrested. He answered flat out, no. We pressed him about October 2021, and again, he said no. It was insane to me. Here was a man sitting across the table from attorneys and a court reporter, so desperate to protect his facade of a reputation that he would lie under oath about something as easily provable as an arrest. But here's the kicker. Darren's own divorce decree confirmed the truth. Melissa herself said in those documents that yes, Darren had been arrested in 2021 for domestic violence, but she downplayed it by saying that they had worked it out. So, which is it? Was he never arrested, or was it an incident you two quietly brushed under the rug? That contradiction spoke louder than anything else. It wasn't the first time Darren had tried to cover up his reality. There was also the time that he had a cardiac event on the beach and had to be revived. He pretended it never happened, just like this arrest, just like so many other things. It's a pattern: denial, lies, and pretending the past doesn't exist. Fast forward to March 15th, 2023. By this point, the lawsuit Darren and Melissa filed had already eaten up months of my life. That day, I had spent hours on Zoom for a probate hearing tied to their claims. By the time I was driving home, I was drained. Like I always did on my commutes, I called Chet. We talked about the day, about the hearing, and eventually, the conversation circled back to Darren. Chet told me things during that call that I'll never forget. He explained how Darren would get right in his face, raise his voice, and even poke him in the chest when money came up. Lois had told my mom the same thing before she passed. Darren's aggression, his bullying, especially when Chet wanted to buy something for himself, or for his kids, or for his grandkids. Darren made it crystal clear: no more gifts for anyone. The only exception, of course, was his daughter, Amanda. And even then, he capped it at $500. And of course, Melissa backed him up. Chet was clearly shaken by all this, and I realized in that moment I couldn't just let Darren get away with attacking me the night that Lois died. Enough was enough. I told Chet that I had to press charges. He agreed. So I did. I sat down and wrote out a sworn statement describing exactly what had happened. I knew how important accuracy was. I was a deputy sheriff before, so I made sure every detail was right. I even included a report my dad had written the night of the incident, so nothing would be forgotten. When I handed it over, the deputy who took the report told me it looked like a solid case. A week later, on March 22nd, I got a call from a detective. He told me he had spoken to Darren, and no surprise, Darren denied ever laying a hand on me. In fact, he said that I pushed him, even though the witnesses agree with me on what happened. The detective said Darren even asked when I had filed the report. When told it was on March 15th, Darren tried to twist it, saying I had just come off a bad Zoom hearing and was retaliating against him. He even claimed that I had been ordered to stop posting about him on social media, and that this was my way of lashing out. That couldn't have been further from the truth. The only bad news I had gotten from that hearing was another delay, because, surprise, they never actually had a case. And as far as the social media posts, yes, I kept posting. And now I've made a podcast about it. That should tell you how much his threats mattered to me. The detective told me that he'd forward the case to the district attorney's office. And as soon as I heard that, I knew it was dead in the water. Cases like this rarely go anywhere after that. What's funny is that those social media posts that Darren was so threatened by were really aimed at Westcom Credit Union, the same bank tied up in all the Darren and Melissa schemes. I gave Westcom proof, solid proof, of what was happening. And what did they do? They blocked me. No call, no investigation, nothing. But I know they saw it, and I know that they know. One win I actually managed to secure was control over Chet's cameras. Darren and Melissa kept blaming Westcom and acting like the system was irretrievable. So I took it straight to the source. I called Google, who owns Nest. After I explained the situation, Google was able to release the cameras from Darren's account. Melissa even tried to send over her fake Geek Squad texts to take them back, but we stopped them cold. I reset the cameras onto Chet's own account, upgraded his network with a new mesh Wi-Fi system, and made sure the cameras were actually working reliably for him. That was one small victory in a long, ugly fight. On June 29th, 2023, at about 4 a.m, Chet called my mom, Kathy. His voice was calm, almost too calm, but his words carried weight. He said he had fallen, hit his head, and needed help. My parents rushed out of the door immediately. Chet had always made one thing clear, though. If something happened to him, family got there before the ambulance. That was his rule. When they walked into his house, the scene was worse than they imagined. Blood stretched in a shocking trail from the guest bathroom into the guest bedroom. Chet had been forced to sleep in the guest room for days because of the damage in his master bedroom that was caused from rain. A year earlier, he'd met with a contractor about finally replacing his roof and installing solar panels, something that he had wanted for years. But Darren shut it down. He told Chet that it was a scam, canceled all the appointments, and again stripped Chet of his ability to make his own decisions. The result? A roof that went unrepaired, a leak that spread into the master bedroom, and damage that ended up costing way more than the original roof and solar project ever would have. So, Chet was stuck in the guest room, an unfamiliar setup. That night, not feeling well, he went into the guest bathroom. In a narrow space between the toilet and the heavy freestanding cast iron tub, he fell. When he tried to sit back up, the sharp underside of the tub caught his head, splitting it wide open. Bleeding heavily, he managed to crawl on his elbows and knees back into the guest bedroom. Still bleeding, still steady somehow, he picked up the phone and called my mom to tell her what had happened. My parents knew that this was beyond what they could handle, and despite Chet's dislike of hospitals, they called an ambulance to get him to the ER. They called me too, and I met them there. I knew how much Chet hates hospitals, so I stayed with him overnight. He was released the next day, cleaned up, but still shaken. What stuck with him the most wasn't just the fall. It was the thought that Darren had put him in this position. If Darren hadn't interfered, if he'd let Chet handle his own business, the roof would have been replaced, the solar would have been installed, and none of this would have ever happened. From that night on, we developed a system. If Chet ever had to go to the hospital, I would be there too, because this might not be the last time, which it wasn't. On November 14th, 2023, around 7:55 p.m., someone knocked on our door and said that they had a delivery for the LeClaire residence. I was actually at the borderline with my dad, not inside, but standing outside watching it being torn down. There was a strange, almost hollow feeling watching that place get demolished. It felt like one small, ugly kind of closure. I didn't see the security camera alert on my phone until after the guy had already left. Anna called me and told me to listen to the recording. The man in the clip said that he had a delivery for me. Anna told him that I wasn't home. He answered that he worked for the county and that it was something related to the courts. The next day, which was November 15th, my parents had a court date, so I assumed it might be related to that. Still, it felt off. The first time anyone had tried to serve my parents, they came to my house. So my immediate thought was that this was just more last-minute, sloppy legal nonsense aimed at throwing us off. On December 2nd, 2023, I created the Spencer Files. Originally, just a private Facebook group, as a way to keep my family updated on the lawsuit with Melissa and Darren. At first, it was simply me posting updates as things happened, but it quickly became something more. It turned into an outlet for me to share what I kept uncovering in the lawsuit, along with the things that I rediscovered in the trust documents Darren had created. One thing I couldn't stop coming back to was the part about Chet and Lois's house. According to the original trust, the house was supposed to be left entirely to Darren and Melissa's daughter, Amanda, and then distributed to her free and clear of the trust on her 25th birthday. But here's the problem. Chet made it clear that this was never something that he or Lois agreed to. As much as they loved Amanda, it made no sense to leave her the house that they were still living in, especially since Amanda is now 29. When we first saw that trust, the lawsuit had already been going on for about 6 weeks or so. That was in 2022, which meant Amanda was already 26. The trust provision about her turning 25 had already expired by then. And here's where it's important to understand how trusts actually work. It was a good thing for Chet and Lois that the trust doesn't go into effect until both of them have passed away. So, even if Darren's version had somehow slipped through, Amanda's 25th birthday clause was already dead in the water by the time we saw it. This is part of why I've been saying that Darren and Melissa were trying to take Chet and Lois's house and sell it out from under them. And here's the proof. The original trust literally said, quote, "Trustee shall set aside this share containing what is currently the creator's primary residence for the sole and complete benefit of creator's granddaughter, Amanda Leanne Moore, to be held in trust for her sole use and benefit until she has attained the age of 25, and to be distributed to her outright and free of the trust when she has attained the age of 25. End quote. Amanda turned 25 back in 2021. There is zero chance that Chet and Lois would have agreed to that arrangement. But the timing makes sense. It explains why Darren and Melissa were getting desperate. I think they were banking on being able to sell that house once Amanda turned 25. And speaking of banking, between October 14th, 2020 and January 12th, 2022, Melissa transferred $280,000 out of Chet and Lois's accounts without their permission. And that was just during that time period. There were other withdrawals before that as well. But in that specific window, while they thought they had the house secured for Amanda, nearly $300,000 disappeared. I have no doubt that most of that money went straight to the so-called dream house. January 22nd, 2024. I may or may not have been served by a process server, and not just any process server, the same guy who showed up at my house back on November 14th, 2023. I actually talked to him for a while this time. Really nice guy. He didn't mention that he had tried before, but I recognized him right away from the security camera footage. And the reason I say that I may or may not have been served is because the paperwork he handed me was odd. According to the documents, I supposedly had a court date on November 15th, 2023 at 9 a.m., 2 months earlier. Yeah, unless my DeLorean is stocked up with plutonium, I'm not making that one. But it turns out Melissa and Darren had decided to drag me into their already frivolous lawsuit. And what they were asking for from me was even crazier. Here's the background. Chet and Lois had written somewhere that they were not going to ask anything back from me for the money that they had put towards my house. They wanted it memorialized that I didn't owe them a dime. I honestly didn't know that provision was written anywhere, but apparently Melissa did, because in the lawsuit, Melissa and Darren demanded that I repay $250,000 to Chet, claiming that he may need it for medical expenses, personal care, or other matters. Their petition literally reads, quote, "Petitioners believe that this money should be paid back to the benefit of Chester D. Spencer, as he may need it for medical expenses, personal care, or other matters. In addition, in the Second Amendment dated September 26, 2022, the residue of the trust is to be divided equally amongst the Spencer's children. As such, petitioners are requesting in order for E.J. Spencer to repay the $250,000. End quote. And you heard that right at the end. It does say E.J. Spencer. They didn't even get my name right. But my takeaway? Simple. If I repaid that money, it would flow into the trust, which means Darren and Melissa would get a cut of it as part of the residue share. They weren't asking for something that Chet even wanted. In fact, he insisted that he didn't want it. They were just looking for another way to line their pockets. And it didn't even stop there. They also added my Aunt Wendy, Melissa and Kathy's sister, to the lawsuit. What exactly they were demanding from her, I still don't know. It's kind of unclear. But the point was obvious. Throw as many names as possible into the fire and see what sticks. This entire lawsuit was and still is a joke. Melissa and Darren's greed and desperation are draining Chet's money on legal fees just to defend the trust, instead of letting him live out his life in peace. To top it off, in the petition, they even brought up the fact that Chet sold his boat. He had gotten sick of the costs, winterizing, storage, endless maintenance fees, so he got rid of it. Melissa and Darren actually demanded a $60,000 credit, arguing that the boat was for their enjoyment and that by selling it, Chet somehow owed them $60,000. The absurdity speaks for itself. One unexpected outcome of being added to the lawsuit was that I finally got access to files and police reports that I had never seen before. And buried in those documents was yet another lie from Melissa, this time straight to the sheriff's department. She claimed that back in 2018, she discovered that I had supposedly convinced Lois and Chet to give me and my mom money for a house. According to Melissa's version, she and Darren hired a civil attorney and forced me and my mom to pay back about $100,000. That was a blatant lie. My mom had nothing to do with my house, and it added a whole strange new layer to the story. In her own words to law enforcement, Melissa admitted that she and Darren were the ones who hired the attorney. Not Chet, not Lois. It was them. That's exactly what I had been saying all along, that Darren and Melissa were the ones controlling the attorney, not my grandparents. Seeing it in her own police report confirmed it. And here's the truth, as I've talked about it before. I repaid that money on my own because I said I would. I did it on January 19th, 2018. I still have the deposit slip. Melissa's attorney didn't even come after me until months later, July 19th, 2018. And just to make things even more suspicious, that same attorney created the trust with Darren on March 9th, 2018. The timing says everything. Another file I got to read shed light on why Chet had not got his guns back yet. Melissa claimed that he was showing signs of dementia and that his memory was failing. She told the deputies that healthcare workers in the home felt unsafe because Chet was supposedly leaving gun paraphernalia around the house. She even went as far as to say that Chet had talked to her about assisted suicide, suggesting that because of Lois's declining health, he might end her suffering with a gun. Are you kidding me? That is beyond outrageous. As I've said before, Chet has never shown signs of dementia, not then and not now. Even at 90 years old, his memory is sharp. The deputies who interviewed him saw that firsthand. And as far as the so-called paraphernalia, what was there left? Melissa and Darren already taken the guns, maybe a magazine, and a paper magazine at that, not one that goes into a gun. And if you know Chet, really know him, you'd know how absurd those claims are. He adored Lois. He was devoted to her and to his faith. The idea that he would ever harm her is unthinkable. It wasn't the first time Melissa had spread lies like this either. She had even told people before that Chet once said that he would use his guns to shoot up the school across the street from his house. I know for a fact that never happened. These weren't just lies. They were character assassinations designed to strip Chet of control, of dignity, and his own rights. Part of my goal with this podcast is to help people see the truth. The claims being made in this lawsuit just don't line up with facts. The dates often don't match reality, and the accusations fall apart under scrutiny. More than anything, I want justice. Not for me, for my parents, and for Chet. Revisiting all of this brings back the emotions I felt as it was all happening. Back then, I didn't know which way things would go. because it was clear that truth and facts weren't the priority of the other side. What breaks my heart is that Melissa and Darren still haven't let this go. Imagine suing your own father right after his wife passes away, dragging him into depositions, draining his money on lawyers, and forcing him to defend himself for years instead of allowing him to grieve. For the past 3 years, instead of healing, Chet has had to fight. He's spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, not to build his legacy, but to defend it against his own daughter. Lois saw this coming. She once warned us about Melissa's erratic behavior, and sadly, she was right. As I am recording this episode, Chet is literally sitting in a deposition with Darren and Melissa's attorney. And yes, they even asked him about this podcast. So, thank you for listening, Mary, and thank you, Melissa and Darren. If I ever make merch, I'll be sure to send you a t-shirt. This whole journey hasn't been easy. It's been 3 years of fighting, of digging through lies, and watching Chet spend time and money that should have been spent enjoying it in peace. But that's exactly why I created the Spencer Files, to make sure the truth doesn't get buried, and to show people how far some will go when greed takes over. Thank you for joining me for the start of Season 2. The story isn't slowing down, and what's coming next will show you just how deep this fight really goes. This is the Spencer Files. Until next time.